Start the 3 nice.
Nick just said.
Send your picture to your dog.
You have to attach a text message service. Oh, I still mean to keep. I mean to use my Amazon buttons. I'm going to go buy a big pushy button thing from
A big red one.
J-Car and sort of mount it on top of the Amazon button.
Okay.
So when they press the button, it pushes the Amazon button, makes a connection, and then causes a photograph to take a picture.
Okay.
So it's just going to hook up a USB to the Raspberry Pi.
Yep.
And then have that sitting in the box on the side. So when they press the button, it will just take a picture.
Sweet. Yeah, you can probably just do that directly with the Raspberry Pi, right? So you just need a switch.
Yeah, I need a switch, but a switch on the Raspberry Pi, whereas I've already got the button anyway. So just
Yeah, but if you push the button, it doesn't have. It's all like TCP/IP. You may have like a second or two delay. Yeah. Whereas if you hook it straight to the Pi, it'll be instant. Because you just need to like connect the two pins of the NPIO, and then it'll see onto a switch. So as you push it down, it connects the circuit, and then the NPIO signal will get sent.
Yes. Yeah.
Alright, ready for this?
Except I've already got a code for the buttons.
Try.
No, I have some more code.
Let's think about those learning experiences.
Then we can put one in the big red button when you get to the code. Stick it on the desk and say, alright, press the button.
Yeah. Pops up on cat screen.
Yeah.
Need a few more minutes?
So everything's as it usually is, and the YouTube says, "You're not giving me enough info. More stream." Plenty of CPU.
I could be wrong.
Live.
Cool.
Funny old YouTube. Go YouTube. Lighting and stuff.
Yeah, and the thing is, like, the active one, you're going to be involved in the active one.
I've got access to
There seem to be hardly any badges left out there.
Oh, yeah.
But there's not as many people. I wonder if some people are joining in.
I think they
Just bumped into someone.
There are a few bots out there.
Alan Marshal speaking. Oh yeah, you downstairs. Okay, I'll come and let you in.
Who's online? What's online?
Fred, you see it?
Oh, yes?
Yeah.
Oh, good, good.
Shall I get them in? You ready?
Yeah, yeah.
Sweet.
Very good.
Scott and Josh are basically
我一会儿就撤了，我单这个幅度的吧。
Yeah, it's the second of the month now. It's actually, yeah, because we had a conflict with another user group.
所以每次说我们开什么会，必须之前要不然不能说。
Yeah, cool.
或者我就看不见。
多少度？300，那咱俩差不多，我也300，336。
All right, welcome along, everyone. Yeah, this is the August edition of our user group. So yeah, today we got two interesting talks. One on Azure Container by Mr. Daniel Scott-Raynsford over there, and then another on SharePoint Communications Sites by Alan Marshal, who's just letting someone in downstairs, I think. So he should be back up in a few minutes. Hands up who hasn't been to one of these before. It's the first time here. One person.
There's always
Two.
one.
Two.
Two.
We're cool. Well, welcome along. If you need to go to the toilet at all tonight, they are past the lifts, you know, when you came up. So you just go past that, and then on the right, there's the entrance to the gents' toilet. To get back in here, you need a swipe card. And that swipe card will be hanging on this door. So Alan has the swipe card at the moment because he needs to come back up, but he'll put it back on that door when he's inside. So just take that with you, otherwise you can't get back. Okay, and you'll be stuck out there. All right. So I think that pretty much covers the housekeeping. So I'll start off with just a bit of coverage of some of the latest news, and then Alan and Daryl can cover some 365 news. So just a few bits of news over the last month that I found interesting. So there's a new Azure App Service tier. Hands up who's played with Azure App Service before? A few of you, yeah, don't be shy. Let's see. Cool. So do the rest of you know what it is, or are you not sure? Not sure? Cool. So if you've ever done any web hosting before, you know how traditionally you had a virtual machine with, say, IIS on it, and then you created a website inside that and put your code into it, and then that virtual machine ran your website. So Azure App Service is basically the same functionality, but without you having to worry about managing the machine itself. So it's kind of like an instance of IIS that just runs your sites. Okay. There's various tiers that you can sign up for in Azure App Service. So starting from a free tier, which obviously means it costs nothing, but it's kind of limited in some of its functionality. It still runs websites fine, but for example, you can't use custom domains and you can't use SSL and that sort of thing. Then it goes up the tiers. So you have a share tier after that, then basic, standard, and premium. So if you've got a very high needs kind of production website, you probably want to run that on a premium tier. So the announcement that came out this month is a new service in preview, or new tier in preview called Premium V2. So as it says, it's pretty much the same functionality as a premium tier, but it's faster. So underlying that instance of IIS I was talking about earlier are still actual machines hosting your website. Okay, it's not like magic that it just works that way. Now those machines with Premium V2 are using a new tier of virtual machine called a DV2 virtual machine. And those machines are basically, they have faster CPUs and a higher memory to CPU core ratio. So it just makes the hosting of your machine, of your website, much more performant. And that's in preview at the moment. The pricing, it's the same price as the original Premium V1 during this preview phase. Obviously, once it comes out of preview and goes to GA, I'm guessing it'll probably be a slight bit more expensive. And availability, it's currently available in South Central US, West Europe, North Europe, and Australia, which is handy. The other regions will be coming online as it approaches GA. And then on the same theme, There's another announcement around the Azure App Service isolated tier, which looks like that. So, of the people who have worked with App Service before, who's worked with App Service environments? Crickets. Okay, so you know how easy app services are to use. You basically just deploy a website. You don't need to worry about managing any of the underlying infrastructure. That's great, but all of those websites are actually hosted on multi-tenanted solutions underneath them. So your website could be sitting on a machine running your competitor's website, essentially. And if you need to get that site to connect to any on-premises any on-premises data, you need to set up like VPN connectivity between it, and it's a little bit of a mission. So it works great for a lot of use cases. If you do have a large-scale, say, web farm that you're running out of Azure, or you need to connect to on-prem data sources for any reason, or you want to ensure the security of that website, so you literally want to isolate it from anyone else's sites running, you would use an app service environment to set that up. So it basically allows an Azure App Service to sit inside your own virtual network rather than sitting inside a shared public virtual network. Okay. To do that in the past, though, or up until now, was actually kind of complicated. So when you set up an app service environment, you had to stand up a front-end pool of workers to actually accept the incoming connections from the internet. And then you had to stand up a back-end pool of workers, which are VMs, which will be running your websites. And then you had an app service, which you deploy on top of those VMs, and then your websites to deploy on top of that. So quite a lot of moving pieces that you need to keep in mind in order to get the benefits of that massive scalability and stability and security of the environment. So contrasting that to the new version, looks like that. So basically what Azure's done is abstracted away all of the back-end, front-end worker pools. So all you're dealing with is the app service plan and the actual websites that are running on it. And that looks remarkably similar to what you get with the regular app service plan. Right. So yeah, you get all the benefit of an app service environment with all the headache of the manageability removed from it. So it's really cool. Kind of sucks though, because at work we've actually just deployed an environment for a customer, architected a couple of months ago. They needed the functionality of an app service environment, so we literally built all of that, and that's all good to go. They're going to production next month, and app service environment V2 comes out, which means that it would have been a whole lot easier to architect and deploy that solution. So yeah, you need to think about cost benefit of actually re-architecting that.
It's much like buying TVs, isn't it, Nick?
Yeah.
Yep. You're always going to find a better new one next week.
Exactly. Except you don't usually need to maintain TVs all that much, whereas like app service environments kind of need a bit of maintenance because you're dealing with all those underlying machines. So some differences then. So app service environment V1, to actually deploy an environment, so to go new app service environment go, it took 2 to 3 hours to actually build that infrastructure in Azure. V2 takes 40 to 60 minutes. That hours should be removed. 40 to 60 minutes. So a whole lot quicker. Still not as fast as a regular app service, obviously, but yeah, a whole lot quicker in that regard. If you want to scale up or scale down the environment to like add additional nodes, in V1 that scaling operation took over an hour. If your website's getting hammered and you suddenly need to add additional nodes into it, it would take an hour to spin up a whole new copy of your website. Whereas V2 takes around 20 minutes. Hey, Costa. And pricing wise, yeah, app service environment was expensive. By expensive, you're looking at a minimum cost of about $3,000 a month, whereas the V2 option is slightly less expensive. So the pricing model changed a whole lot. In V2, I think there's a base price of $1,000 a month, and then about $400 an instance on top of that, which is better than V1, where you had to pay for like 6 P1 virtual machines, which worked out to be like $2 or $3,000 or something. So yeah, a whole lot better. And the third bit of interesting news was this, Azure Container Instances, which Daniel's going to be talking about later. So that's my Azure news. 3 365 guys. We'll have a chat.
I'll do the news.
You can do the news. I'll take your phone.
Yeah.
Let in any more late
Any more
comments.
strays?
Yep.
Yeah. Right. Anyone use Microsoft Teams? Good, I can lock it down now and stop you using it. This is always a problem for some people from a compliancy perspective is people could just add in a whole bunch of external third-party services and then potentially cross data between their on-prem and these services via Teams. So you can now actually go through and say whether you're even going to allow external apps at all, and then maybe which ones you'd allow for your organization. If the users already have those, they'll suddenly stop working, and then the user experience, if they go into Teams, they'll just disappear. So they can still go add an app, but then nothing will be listed because none of them are allowed. The one that you might want to turn on though is this side loading, because it means that you can do both testing of your own apps as well as being able to just have internal only apps. Otherwise you're going to have to publish your corporate app to the App Store and anyone else could potentially use it as well. So the side loading is probably something that you might want to turn on as part of this. Blocking guest access. So there are some settings already where you can actually block external sharing, but actually and you can stop people adding guests altogether to groups, but there was no way to actually block it based on a domain list of allowed or blocked. So now you can choose one or the other. You either choose allowed domains or you choose blocked domains. I don't know how big the list of blocked domains would be. That could be quite extensive. Anything that ends in RU or something along those lines maybe. But anyway, it's different to the SharePoint one. So the SharePoint one always had an allowed and blocked domains. So the guest one to Office 365 groups works independently. So you could allow it to be a guest in a group and then block it in SharePoint so they couldn't access the SharePoint site, which might be a sort of strange behavior for the end user. So you need to consider both of those together. But if people have already added guest members, then none of this applies because it's actually only part of the interface when they go to add people, not actually a policy that applies over the top.
So you'd liken that to the Skype for Business allow and block list, wouldn't you?
Yeah,
Domains.
which is different. Yeah,
It's a different list again, but it's achieving the same
that's
thing.
a different list if allowed and blocked. If you hadn't noticed, links and announcements lists in SharePoint in the modern sites still actually look like the old lists. That's kind of sort of why would they not all look the same? So Microsoft now actually updated the links and announcements so they actually look like a normal list like everything else. So you can create flows over the top and power apps and things like that. The only thing that doesn't work is you can't add one of these lists yet to the homepage. So like you can go add lists. That works for any other sort of custom list, but doesn't work for these two yet.
And you know why that is?
No.
Yeah. Well, they're trying to channel us towards using the news feature, which makes a news article push up to the hero web part. So it's a lot prettier and it's sort of really folded into the new way of getting articles and news out there. So that takes care of your announcements list. And then there's the quick links web part, which is supposedly the replacement for the links list. So I found this announcement quite confusing when I read it. I had to read it a couple of times thinking, well, you're telling us you're modernizing something, but you don't want us to use it on the front page, which is where we would normally use it. So, question mark. But
Yeah.
I guess we'll find out.
I think it's probably for people who've already got these in their sites from historical ones, and then, just wonder why it's sort of changing as they move around between the views. The new signing experience, surprise! Anyone like that? It was suddenly dropped on everyone. Apparently, it broke a few applications. Apparently, it broke ShareGate,
for 4 days.
a couple other third-party tools. But actually, it's quite nice. So, whereas before you used to get the Office 365 page and you put your domain name in, and especially if it was like a Windows account or on Microsoft.com, would work and stay there, but then any other service it will bounce out of that page and go to a password sign-in. Now, if you've used the Azure AD experience, you get your look and feel. So if you've customized the look and feel because you've got Azure AD Premium, then it will actually just have your username and password and won't do this kind of redirect to another page for signing, which is really nice. And that also updated the mobile view as well at the same time. And you can just say, it actually pops up for the users and say, do you want to try the new experience? And everyone's like, what new experience? So some people obviously tried it out. There was a few announcements actually this month that were like in my message center that said, sorry, we forgot to tell you about this beforehand. There was like 3 of them that they forgot to tell us beforehand that they were doing it. So it's always good to keep update on the admin center because they might surprise you as well as helping you plan really well what you need to do. I mean, sometimes some of these changes are not going to have much of an impact, so they don't announce them as far ahead in time. But this one obviously had quite a bigger impact than they expected. SharePoint site theming, they're changing the way this works. I haven't got this in my tenant yet, so this is kind of pretty new, even though it said this is coming this month.
I think it's 21st of August is when it starts rolling to first release. Yeah.
So normally you went change look and feel, and there was this page that showed you what a SharePoint modern site would look like in different colours. So they're just simplifying that, and you'll be able to just go to the little cog in the settings in the corner and go change look, and it will drop down this view, and you can go, oh, I like it blue, orange, red, purple, green, or grey. There are no other colours in the world. There are just these things to choose from. But the theming and stuff still applies because you can use the classic change the look options, and then you can upload still your own look and feel from there and do it that way. But every other colour is obviously coded for here, so you don't need any more. And then we get to communication sites. So these rolled out to first release last month. Some people had them, some didn't. I can't tell you why that was the case. And then they're actually going to roll it out. They're called public rollout, which actually means they're going to roll it out to all the tenants, not just the first release, which is actually happening across this month, which means that even if you're not on first release, you'll now be able to create one of these sites. And you also won't be able to turn off creating one of these types of sites because the settings at the back end don't actually link up to this actual process of creating sites, which I'll show you in a minute. Right, so we're going to get into these communication sites, and I'll just show you kind of how they work. Look, dual screen, quick. So this is the original message in the message center. So this is my, released on July the 29th. It actually didn't arrive into my tenant until the end of July almost. Because I realized this little feature to do with first release. If you go to setup, and one of the other MVPs noticed this. Where's the profile? Sorry. Settings and organization profile. Because this is my personal tenant, it's the Alan Marshal.co.nz tenant. Sign in again. This is the new sign-in experience, by the way. My whole tenant's on first release, so I didn't bother selecting myself for first release. I just said, anyone in the tenant, because I don't really care. But if you've got like a production tenant, then you're going to want to obviously control who would get first release. So it meant that actually I didn't see the communication sites for ages. And then I discovered this little action here where it says it's first release for selected users. In this particular case, and I think this is the first one that Microsoft have done this way, is that rather than roll out a new release to a tenant that's got everyone on first release, they only rolled it out to tenants if you'd had selected users on. So I turned on selected users and then selected all the users, and which is exactly the same outcome, but is actually how it got it working. So they must have had some check somewhere. So
Alan, there was a result for that. Like I tried the same kind of workaround, and all of a sudden Forms disappeared because Forms is in preview. I was like, did they roll something back? And apparently, if you had one on but not the other, Forms was out to first release for the whole tenant, but not for a selected group, and vice versa for communication sites.
Yeah, so just pick which one you want, and then decide how you're going to set this. A bit curious. Anyway, so yeah, once I've done that, then I've got communication sites. Now, the way you create communication sites is there is only one way to create it. Because you can't actually, as an administrator, go here and go new private site collection and pick the communication site template. It doesn't actually show up in the list of templates to be able to create. Right? The only way you can actually create it is if you're in SharePoint and you go create a site. And then you get the option of which ones you want to create. And the other thing in the back end is you can actually set, are you going to allow people to create sites? And if so, do you allow them to create a group and a classic site, or a group and or a team site by itself? But it doesn't have the option to say, oh, actually I only want team sites but not communication sites, or only groups and not comm sites. So if you enable people to create a site or a group, they actually get both options whether you wanted it or not. Right? So anyway, you go communication site, and then the process works exactly the same as creating any other type of site if you were going to create a team site. And I actually have a couple of choices here as well. So Microsoft have created some sort of predefined layouts or templates, so you can get a kind of idea of how these work. So if you're trying this out, I would suggest kind of creating either, creating both and seeing what it does. So create a topic one and see what sort of content it adds, try to showcase and see what the difference is. And then once you're kind of happy that you understand how the process of creating one works, then create a blank one. Right? And then you can effectively achieve exactly the same outcome as the topic one, but you're sort of then in more control over the content on that page to start with. The other thing to point out here is because I can't create it at in managing site collections, I can't create this at the root level of my site at the moment. So I can't change my SharePoint.Alan Marshal site. I can only change, I can only add a new site collection and then say use the communication site as the site collection. And one of the requests is that people want to be able to change their top level landing page site to be a communication site. And I think that's been heard loud and clear, and that will probably come at some point. But at the moment it has to be a brand new site, because there's no feature. Like if you go in and create a communication site, if you look at the site collection features or site features, it's not a feature or capability that's turned on. It's some other functionality that's sort of making it a communication site. So you can't even enable an existing site to be one of these. So it'll have to come up with some way of migrating over existing root sites to do this. Anyway, once you create one, you get a little communication site. I actually recolored this one just to make it really awful green, because obviously wanted to test the projector's ability to project green in a nice way, and it doesn't. It's a much darker green on here, much more pleasant.
Looks great from here.
Yeah, looks great from here.
Come back here, have a look.
Yeah. So when you this is based on the topic layout, right? So when it creates the topic layout, at the very top of the page here, I've actually customized the menu bar. I'll get back to that in a minute. But it actually has what they call this hero web part. So the hero web part starts with, here's how to use a communication site. And you can actually go through to these, and Microsoft have actually put in little help links underneath it, which is quite good. So there's some content actually already underneath there to learn how to use a communication site and how to customize it. And then as you scroll down the page, there's some if you're familiar with a modern site, there's some very common web parts in here. So I've got the news web part, which is the same as what you'd get on a modern team site. I've also got events, which is from a modern team site, and my documents list. So actually there's really no difference between this and what is a traditional modern site that you'd get if you created a 365 group. All the differences is mainly that this is a full bleed site, plus they've added some additional web parts. But the thing that they released that is probably the nicest thing that makes this into more of a usable site for laying out content is they created a concept of columns. Now, if you haven't seen this in edit mode before, you notice it didn't do a refresh. It just made this all kind of nicely editable and changeable. So I can go in and edit web parts, change details, change how I want stuff to appear, do any other configuration in there. But the other thing I can do is I can add new web parts. And if you click on the plus sign, and there's a special place to click on this, I'll come back to it in a second, you'll actually notice there's this section layout. So within each of these areas down the page, I can actually say how I want that section laid out. So I can actually say, well, actually, I'd like this section laid out into 2 columns. And then you get this split where you can then add an image on the left and some text on the right and different web parts side by side. And there's sort of 3-column layouts, and there's like a wider column on the left and a smaller column on the right. So now actually it gets a bit more usable as a kind of full publishing page that talks about a team or a department or the HR landing page, and then eventually potentially your intranet homepage. Because rather than just being straight down web parts down the page, you can now actually arrange the content quite
Alan,
nicely.
do you think that's going to be the same layouts we'll see in all the other team sites?
Yes, I know. We'll get to that in a minute. Daryl,
I'm excited.
stop jumping
I'm
ahead.
super excited.
Now, one thing to note is that if I come further down here, you'll notice there's this bar doesn't go all the way from the left to the right. You know, it's a bit shorter, right? Because this bar is actually already within a section, right? And if I click on that, I actually don't get the section layout option. All I can add is web parts, right? So if you're wondering why you don't see the section layout, it's because you've clicked on the wrong plus, right? So just move your mouse around and eventually you'll find the one that's the full bleed line, and then you'll get all these options for the different layouts. Yeah. Now they actually added this back into a normal site. So this is a straight modern site. I already had this site before the communication site rollout. So this was already in my tenant. I didn't create this afterwards, which means that Microsoft have actually pulled in the same capability into these sites. So again, if I go to the top of this one, I get section layout, and I can then change my standard modern SharePoint page and make it into columns. So now a bit more flexible than just a straight down content page. So it's just a couple of options out how you now organize that information. Now there's a couple more web parts I think that were also added as part of this, but they are available in both. So if we just go back to this page, just going to go add. So these were standard like the ones at the top, but during this actual rollout there was a few others that were added, which were the stream web part, which is currently in preview, was added to this, and you also see the list preview one, which was already rolled out. Is anyone using Stream yet? This guy's using Stream. Oh, cool. He's using Stream. Now, one thing changed with Stream. Like when Microsoft originally talked about Stream, they said if you're already an Office 365 user, use the Office 365 video, and we'll migrate that into Stream. Right? But if you don't use Stream, because we won't migrate the content the other way. That has actually changed, because now if you use Stream, then that's fine, because now you can create groups through Stream, and it'll create an Office 365 group with all the other content behind it. And you now get 2 services. So now you've got Office 365 video, which will migrate your content eventually into your Stream tenant, or you can use Stream and just use that as your default. So if you're not doing video today, then just use Stream, because it's a better service. Now, a couple of things I can do with Stream. I can actually add a single video, or I can add a whole channel to the actual stream, and then it'll actually create like a little video sort of side by side and say, here's all the videos. So you can add the training portal, or you can add, here's how to use Office 365
Recording
landing
meetings.
page. Recording meetups. Here's all our recorded meetups, yeah. So they'll work fine. So there's a couple of really nice web parts. Now, other things that you can customize, you can actually add extra entries into the menu at the top, and you can make it a hierarchy. So you can actually, as I've got here, the comms page is actually a sub-page of underneath portal. So you can create sort of a bit of a sort of menu system. But one thing I discovered is that you can, although you can create a sub-site, So I created I went create subsite, create departments. This is a modern page that sits underneath that. It allowed me to do it, but then I lost all my navigation. So even though I said this site use the parent site navigation, I actually don't have any of the parent site navigation. All I have is this site's navigation, which is departments. So having a sub-site structure doesn't really work. If you wanted to use it for some sort of department portal or a hub or something like that, then probably just create all your pages in the root library and then just use the menu to sort of arrange them as if they're sub pages, and then that'll work fine. But don't try and create subsites at the moment, because the menu system is just not going to work. Right? If I am actually on the home page though, I can actually create new modern pages, and those will work rather nice. And discard that. Oh, those pages do have versioning, by the way. So now I discarded that, it went back to the previous version. So you can have previous versions. Now if I go new, I can actually create things like lists and document libraries in here, like in any other type of site. But I can also create two types of pages. Now one is a news post, which means it'll actually end up in the news web part on the page. And the other one is just the standard page, so I can just add some more content to the site. The only difference between the two is one piece of metadata, and the piece of metadata says promoted something, right? That's the only difference. And in fact, it doesn't mean promoted because it's a piece of news. So actually, the heading is actually misleading, but is actually the only difference between a page and a news post is one piece of metadata. Now, if I pick a page, it actually asks me how would I like to arrange this page by default. So what I can say is, oh yeah, I like the multi-column format or the single column format. But if I went blank page, then there's nothing stopping me from using that and just specifying at this point I want it in 2 columns. Right? It's just to get users started about and used to the idea without having to lay the page out themselves. The other nice thing you can do though is you can also change the image out. So that little image banner across the top, I can change that now, make it a different one. It used to be fixed, and you couldn't change the image. It was the one Microsoft said you should have, and you couldn't actually change it to something else. But now I can pick some other image that I want to put across the top, and it'll actually then, you can then say, oh yeah, I'll have like people's faces there. This is a cool page. There we go. And then just add other content to my page. And then publish it. So you still get a concept of draft pages. So if you're working on a page, you can just save where you're up to and you don't have to publish it. So even though it doesn't have the full approval cycle thing that a web publishing page would have, you do get some sort of, not release, but like you can actually sort of draft it and then actually work out, is this a nice looking page, show it to somebody before you actually publish it for everyone to view. So like those 4-headed people, it's kind of nice. Not my best image, but that's all right. The other thing I discovered as well, this was I was messing around with the concept of this franchise portal. So the concept of using it for an extranet, right? Where you'd want to mainly publish content out for people to consume as an external party. But the thing I discovered is because all these sites, even if you create a new group, it's still not listed in the list of site collections, even though it is a site collection. You can't actually change the setting to allow external users. So I thought I'd experiment anyway. And if you run a nice little bit of PowerShell, I do write PowerShell now and again. Well, I do mainly demo 365 stuff. I can write I can plagiarize PowerShell. That's probably closer to what I do. You can actually enable the sharing capability and say enable external user sharing on that site. And you can do it for a modern site as well. So you can enable external sharing without adding guest users to a group. The same process actually works. And then as my own personal account, so this is me. So you'll see it's like Pommy Alan _extra.co.ext, which means I'm an external user. and I can actually access this site. Actually, a week ago it didn't work because it wasn't actually released, because as an external user I'm not a first release person. So it didn't work. It like sort of come up, and then some of the web parts are like, I can't show this. And other people notice like the left menu then pops up and things like that. But now actually I can access this site, and it looks exactly the same with my little news stream I just published in there in events and documents. Right. So you can actually use it potentially as an extranet type solution. And that was about it. It is sort of limited. I guess there's no like, full top level nav and things like that. But yeah, as a kind of publishing portal site, like a lot of customers we're talking to are sort of considering using this. If they're on-prem SharePoint, then they're considering, rather than just migrating their publishing pages into online, they're actually looking at going to this instead. Simply because this has mobile capable, or works in the mobile app, rather than trying to make the SharePoint publishing into a mobile experience. And also people that are then looking at external portals and things like that are looking to use this, or small department sites, things like that. So the concept of like an intranet is becoming just a few pages at the top level of a site, and then everything else is probably a communication site. And that's probably where most people are going with this. Any questions? Do you know what a communication site is? Hopefully, right. Good. We'll move along.
Right.
More techie Azure stuff. Daniel.
Come on up there.
So you've got a hub to plug into.
Yeah, plug into that.
For internet, for intertubes.
Yep, I'll
Awesome.
get you all connected over wireless.
That'd be awesome. Maybe get a mouse as well. Then. All right.
So the access point.
Oh, which one is it? That one there? Yeah, here's it. It's password 1, isn't it?
Oh yeah.
So yeah, while we're setting this up, my name's Dan, and I am a recovering software developer. So
Hi Dan.
I'm going to try not to do too much developer heavy stuff, but containers is a bit of one of those technologies that lives on the edge of the infrastructure and the development world. Gives a bit of has a lot of use for both sides. So I'm not going to demo a lot of code, but I am going to. There will be a possible Visual Studio instance popping up briefly. So
And if you need to duplicate screen to throw it on the projector when you're ready,
yes.
you'll see that. Good.
Oh, don't know what I'm looking up there. Okay. See if this is going to render. So I even prepared a presentation. It's going to work. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a couple of things today. So who has ever used containers? Got one person. Come on, has someone heard of containers? Yeah. Of course, you've probably heard Docker and Kubernetes and all the other words that go along with it. Containers are sort of one of those things that sort of burst out And if you look on Azure, you'll sort of, and search for containers, you'll get like about 50 different services available. But there's a couple of new ones. One that's been around for a couple of months, and one of them that's really sort of came out, as Nick said, I think last week. So the main one, I'm going to talk about ACI as the main one, which is Azure Container Instances. And basically it's a way of running containers or getting started with containers really, really easily. Typically it was pretty hard, or there was a lot of infrastructure that went along with it. But as part of that, I'm going to talk about ACR, or Azure Container Registry. So one of the things with containers is that you can either deploy someone else's container. So, you know, you might have, I want to run a Splunk instance in a container, or I want, you know, some other service, I want to run that in a container and deploy it. That's cool. But the other use for containers is you might have a website, your company might have some app they're deploying, they write it, it's got their IP in it, they want to keep that precious, but they want to still be able to run it in a container. So typically you would normally deploy your images up to Docker Hub, but that's a public registry. I could go download your IP and run it, and I could pretend to be, you know, run your IP. So the idea with the Azure Container Registry is it's a private storage place for container images that, you know, your business might want to run. And then you can use that container registry to run these containers that you create. It might have your website in it. You can run that on-prem, or you can run it up in the cloud in Azure, in one of these many Azure services. Yeah, far away.
So what actually is a container? So if, say, we start at the hypervisor.
Yeah, if you think, okay, the hypervisor level allows you to virtualize the infrastructure itself that it's running on, the hardware. A container infrastructure basically virtualizes the operating system itself. So you would then have a lower layer of a hypervisor. Above that, you have a single operating system shared by all containers running on that infrastructure. That allows you to just basically deploy or publish just the bit of your app that actually
changes. The container running on the hypervisor with operating system.
The container infrastructure, or the container host, such as Docker, runs on top of the hypervisor inside an operating system like Windows Server 2016.
Oh, so the operating system runs on the hypervisor?
Yes, and then on top of that you have Docker, and then the Docker runs the container. And you could have, it gives you a lot more ability of scale. So, and I'll actually cover some of the different Docker technologies, or container technologies I should say, that you can run in Azure. You can run one of these on-prem, but there's about 5 in Azure. So anyway, I'm going to start with Azure Container Registry. As I said, it's a private registry service, so you can stick your IP up in it. You can use Azure AD to secure it, so that, you know, you can grant access to only certain people, and you can do things like lock it down and say, oh, this group of people can publish containers, and these group can read containers. And that's all managed through AAD. But there's basically there's 2 types of registries. The first one was unmanaged, and they created that came out a few months ago, probably even longer. And that was where you had to create a storage account, and then you created an ACR, an Azure Container Registry, and said, Azure Container Registry, use this storage account to store my images. And that was pretty cool. But just a couple of weeks ago, I think it was a few weeks ago, they came up with a managed registry where basically takes away the storage. There's still storage, you just don't have any visibility on it. You just say, I want a container registry, and it provisions everything for you underneath the hood. Inside a registry, you basically can store as many different images as you like, and you can have like multiple versions of each image. So, you know, I might have all my websites from the first day I deployed it. I might have, you know, version 1, version 2, version 3, version 4, and I can run up any of those in any order, and I can run 50 of them if I wanted to on a single piece of infrastructure, any number. I won't go into too much detail because I know there's probably a lot of stuff here that doesn't actually matter too much, but as I said, that you've really got 2 ways of logging into ACR. You can use Azure AD Service Principals, or you can use an admin account. You can't use your user account. You can only use a service principal or an admin account. And that was something I found out the hard way when I was trying really hard to log in with my Scott-Raynsford at onmicrosoft.com account. No, it doesn't work. Don't try it. You can't do it. So, as I said, there's a bunch of things you can use ACR with. the main one is Docker hosts. So if you've got a Docker host on, in your office in your data center, you can use that. But you can also use it on Docker hosts in Azure. So if you've just stood up an IaaS VM in Azure, you've installed Docker on it, you can use it with that. You can also use Azure Container Service, which, if there's anyone here tried Azure Container Service, yeah, when you provision Azure Container Service, you end up with all these VMs, all sorts of infrastructure. It's a big piece of kit. Azure App Service, that's basically what Nick was talking about, except for Linux. So basically, you can create a Linux container and then deploy that into Azure App Service for Linux. You've got Azure Batch. So Azure Batch is often used for cross-code and transcoding of video, big heavyweight. I need 500 machines for 5 hours to do a whole lot of work, and then I want to delete them all. So you can use ACR with that. And then you've got Azure Service Fabric, which is, we won't even go there, that is a really heavyweight technology. I think Xbox Live runs on it. And
It's like everything.
yeah, it's like Bang, and it's like, you name it, it runs on it. And then of course, down the bottom, the big one, Azure Container Instance, which is what I'm going to demo today, but I'm going to start with ACR first. Creating an ACR, you can do it in the portal, it's pretty simple, or you can do it with PowerShell, my favorite, and CLI, ARM template. Just a word about Manage though. Manage is still in preview, so you can't use PowerShell and you can't use Azure CLI yet. You can still use an ARM template, but I'm actually just going, I've got one provisioned, so I won't actually show that. It's pretty basic. And then we'll go, might as well do a demo on it, because what I'm going to do, just to give you an idea, there's two parts to this demo. I'm going to create an image with my app. It's an awesome app. You'll be really impressed. Clearly I'm a developer. And I'm going to put that image up in ACR, and then I'm going to run up an Azure Container Instance with it. So let's, hopefully this works. I'm just going to bring up Visual Studio.
So will PowerShell come to the managed?
Yes, it will.
Is there a reason why you would use unmanaged then?
No, I wouldn't use it. I would definitely recommend it. There are a couple other little features I glossed over there. I'll come to in the next bit that you get with ACR, and that's REST endpoints. So basically, if I push a new image, or someone on my team pushes it, it might send out. I can tell it to send out a notification, say to my MS Teams channel, could say, hey, Dan's pushed a new image of the website, go check it out here. So you can set up REST APIs and all that sort of stuff. So, you can't tell
Just
me.
escape from your presentation.
So what? Okay, so I'm just gonna.
So Docker runs on your operating system, okay? Is that right?
Yep.
So what's the difference between running Docker and running just a virtual machine? Is Docker a virtual machine?
No. Well, if you think about it, if you would say I wanted 10 copies of my website, and I was typically going to run that on a virtual machine.
Okay.
Oh, yep. Typically, I'll run a virtual machine, 10 copies of that virtual machine. And of course, I'm now going to have 10 operating systems running on those virtual machines. Now, that's quite an overhead, and it takes a long time to provision them, and it's a lot of duplication. But if I'm using a container, the containers can then share the underlying operating system. They're still isolated from themselves, and they see themselves as the only thing on the machine, but I'm no longer duplicating that operating system 10 times or 50 times. I'm one operating system, 10 containers, and those containers start up very, very quickly. And if I say I write this app and I want to deliver it to the infrastructure operations teams that are going to run it, I'm delivering the entire infrastructure definition to them. So none of this works on my machine. The idea is that you've delivered them the machine. You haven't just delivered them the app they're going to run. So it does reduce a lot of the overhead, and when you see a container start up, they start up extremely quickly, within 2 to 3 seconds. So if you want to scale them up or scale them out, you could go from one container to 10 containers in 30 seconds. Whereas if you try to do that with VMs, there's a lot of overhead. So basically, it results in a lot more density.
And some benefits around servicing as well, right? So if you have to patch your OS,
Yeah.
instead of having to patch 100 OS instances, you migrate a bunch of containers over to your freshly patched machine, and you delete the old or patch the old container host.
Absolutely, absolutely. So yeah, that's a great point. This is one of these things, containers, when you start listing the benefits, you realise there is just so many. So okay, here's my lovely app. I'm going to run it. The great thing about Docker and containers is I can run this container that I've written on my machine. I can run it in the cloud, I can run it anywhere, and it's going to run exactly the same. So I'm going to run this. Now let's hope this works. I'm actually running this in a Linux container on my machine, on my Windows box. Now you'll see my app. It's going to come up. So at the moment it's just building. The first time it builds, it takes a few seconds.
What's this language here?
This is actually just it's actually a .NET Core app.
Where in the container is this?
And it's all right.
It's launching a container.
It is launching. It will launch the container. It's going to start up.
So it's Docker.
Except Docker's just crashed on me.
Yeah.
So
Perfect.
yeah, I love this. So give me a second.
So that was Docker script, was it?
No, this is actually just a HTML. It's just a web page.
Oh, okay.
It's actually a web app with just a web page saying some nice stuff. I'm going to just restart Docker. This isn't actually Docker crashing on me. Docker crashed before I started this process. It just does this from time to time. Probably because I'm sitting here demoing to you guys. So I'm just going to edit that and start that back up. Well, that's handy. I actually do, luckily enough, when you build a container and you build a container image, it actually stores that image on your machine. So worst case scenario, I can just still push this image up. But I'd rather build it and show you exactly what that's doing. So Docker's just starting up here, as you can see. You can't see it's a tiny little image. So while that's starting, have you guys got any other questions about what I'm talking about so far? Cool. Oh yeah.
So with Docker container, all you can do is IIS?
No, you can. A Docker container can run Linux or Windows. Essentially, if you want to run a Linux container, you've got to run it on a Linux host. There's a caveat to that. If you run a Windows container, you've got to run it on a Windows host. So because the container shares the underlying operating system, essentially, so you wouldn't run however, there is an exception to this. As you can see, I'm about to run a Linux container on a Windows host. But what it's actually doing is using Hyper-V to spin up a Linux VM and then deploy that container into that VM. So that's Docker is running again. So let's try that again. So this will hopefully, and while that's starting, I'm actually going to bring up the PowerShell window because I've actually do a little bit of stuff. Hey?
One you prepared earlier.
One I prepared earlier. Well, believe it or not, I've got a whole bunch of code. Normally I would have set up a build pipeline and had all this automated, but you won't see anything and I'll just go, that's great, and I could have done anything for you. So as you can see, that's building. Now there we go. So my Visual Studio helpfully has now run my container. So that's just a web app. It's just running on a web. As you can see, it's running on my local host. I could go and there's my stuff. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to publish my image, which is taken on from my machine, putting it up into the Azure Container Registry. So I'll close that. What I can do over here, I'll just use magnifier so you can see what I'm doing. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to show you this. This is my image. Ooh.
So on a virtual server, could you have a number of containers that are running, the virtual server being Windows, say Windows Server 16, could you have a number of containers that are independent instances that could be, say, remote desktoped and accessed as a standalone 16 operating system?
No, because Docker basically doesn't expose a UI or any kind of GUI. It's all console driven, so you're really only going to run server type applications inside it, like web apps. I mean, there's talk of running things like DNS servers and
So you
DHCP.
can PowerShell into each of them.
Oh yes, you can.
Yeah,
Of
so
course
that's,
you can. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing it.
Instead of IDPing into it, you literally spin up as many containers as you want. You can PowerShell into each of them, and then do what you want.
Yeah. So let's see. So I'm just this magnifier is very confusing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to publish my little Docker container up to my ACR. Well, before I do that, I'll just show you the ACR. Oops. Show you what an ACR looks like in Azure. Stop my debug while it's working. So this container is still running, even though I have I've gone and exited the browser and so on. So it's still running on my machine. Azure. Okay, which one are we going to run it on? That one, yeah.
New sign experience.
Yeah, great news Sunday experience. That's working.
I'm like, yeah, great new sign-on experience is not working. It's stopped. So I've got a couple of ACRs in here in a nice resource group, of course. So I've got a managed one and an unmanaged one. And of course, with the unmanaged one, I've got a storage account with it. But we're going to look at basically be using the, I think I'm going to be using the managed one. So if you actually look in the ACR in Azure, you can actually see any container images you've stored. So you can see who pushed them and what they contain. So if I go down here to repositories, I can see that I've got some. Got my demo app, which I pushed earlier, and I can see all my previous versions of it. I've been pushing various versions, 1.4, 1. Done this demo a few times just to make sure it worked. And I can actually see the content of the image, but basically this is a full app. There is, I could deploy this anywhere, any Linux host running Docker, I could go and run it. .NET Core, anything. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to push my image again. And I use a little command to do that. So I'm going to do, well, before I do that, I'm going to just, I'll just push it. So you all now know my service principal password, so I'll go change this afterwards unless you're really quick.
It's recorded.
It's recorded on YouTube. Hey Google.
Right, well, all my credit, I've only got $30 credit or something left, so just go nuts. Okay, so I've logged it. Basically what I did was I logged into my container registry and using a service principal account. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to tag my image. What this means is basically saying I'm tagging this as version 1.5, and I'm saying I'm pushing this to the registry. So this, of course, is a bit of a developer thing, and they would normally automate this whole process. But now if we look at Docker images, we'll see there is now a 1.5 image I've created.
And you destroyed the
There.
predictor.
Yeah, it's back again.
Oh. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to push them. And this will write this up to Azure Container Registry. And so see how fast this internet connection is? But we're talking, this is the entire image. This is all the operating system, everything. And this is about 17 megs. And most of that is the .NET Core code, supporting code. My website was like, 200 bytes or something. Yeah, kilobyte if I'm lucky. So it is in fact only pushed 1,792 bytes, because what it's done is it said, well, you only changed a little bit of the underlying container. So every time I push a new version, it just sends up the data that was changed. So again, that means if I'm deploying a new container, and I've already deployed that container before, it just needs to download the difference. So I can get a new container with my new version with 1,700 bytes. So anyway, now I've done that, I can go over to Azure Container Registry and do a little bit of a refresh. I'm just going to go to this one right here, and you'll see my 1.5. So my 1.5 has now been pushed up, and I could have had a REST API bound to that, and that could have notified my team or the business unit itself, hey, there's a new version of the app that's about to go out. So now that is ACR in a nutshell. Now the reason why I actually took you through that first is because ACI uses this really heavily, so I wanted to have an image that we could actually demo. So just before we finish the ACR bit, ACR, as I said, there's the two types. There's the unmanaged and the managed. The managed, you really have 3 tiers for it, so basic, standard, and premium, and that really just determines the performance of the hard drives underneath it. So it's whether you're using SSD. The number of webhooks as well, but I mean, if you need 100 webhooks, you're doing some heavyweight stuff. And of course, the amount of data you're transmitting to and from the storage account. So as you can see, I only had an image of 1700 bytes. So 10 gigabytes is going to go a long way if you've only got a few images.
What's the compute and memory?
Well, typically ACR doesn't have any compute or memory. ACI, however, that's where you get to determine your compute or memory. So ACR is really just a hard drive. So, and you're not going to pay for any compute. So I will jump through just a couple of limitations. Docker search isn't supported. Normally, if you set up a registry, you might want to search it and say, I want to know all the images I've got available to deploy. And currently, that's not supported. I presume that's coming. I haven't found out. It's not a critical feature, and you can't create a managed Azure instance with PowerShell, which of course makes me very sad. It is coming though. Okay, this is probably the most important part, which is ACI, or Azure Container Instances. As I said, if you've ever tried to deploy an ACS or an Azure Container Service, it ends up with all these VMs, and it's really quite expensive to run. And if you just want one container, like my little demo app, it's a pretty expensive way of running just one container. And if you want, say, that one container for half an hour, again, it's a lot of infrastructure you're provisioning for just half an hour's work. So ACI basically provides a way for you to just run that one container. So it's like containers but PaaS. So as Azure Web Apps is sort of a IIS but without the virtual machine, ACI is like containers without the massive amount of hardware that goes around it. Hypervisor level security, so that means you're actually running on shared infrastructure. So there is a VM underneath it somewhere, but it's using a hypervisor to isolate that container away from any other containers that might be running on it. So you could be running on a competitor's, the same hardware as a competitor's hardware. So the hypervisor level security basically isolates that container away.
Is that shielded VMs?
Essentially it is. So it's using that whole, it's using the isolate, actually, I think it's, hypervisor, with Windows Server 2016 containers they released, you have isolated containers and standard containers, and I think it uses the hypervisor underneath. They haven't released a lot of detail, they've just said hypervisor level security. So, it sort of should be isolated away from each other. But whether they're really, what level of isolation that is, I guess that'll come out. One other point, this is still in preview, so it's pretty beta. You can, when you provision a container, you can make them different sizes, 1 to 8 cores or 1 to 14 gigabytes of memory. And you're really actually paying by the second for it. So you're paying per CPU, for amount of memory. So if you want to run a container for 5 minutes, you're only going to pay for 5 minutes at the number of CPUs and memory you're using. It has private and public IP, so you can publish this on the internet. You can run your entire, your online web shopping system from these things. You wouldn't need anything else. Or you can have, you might run some internal systems where I work, we're actually looking at using this for things like test clients and various services that we might run during the development process. So it's really great because you can just spin these things up, use them for that small amount of time and get rid of them. Great for testing, if you want to test your app, run some tests on it, you're only paying for that small amount of time that you run them. Okay, so basically, one of the things with containers is you often need persistent storage underneath them. Containers, once they're deleted, they're gone. They're not like a virtual machine where you shut them down and you start them back up and everything's still where you left it. Containers, you delete them, they're gone. So if you need persistent storage, what you do is you use an Azure file share and it can be mounted in there. It's still a little bit, still reasonably tricky to do, but I did write a blog post on it the other day, so if you're really keen to actually do that, have a look at my blog post I've listed at the end. And you can run either Windows or Linux containers. So if you want to run a Windows app, you technically you could run something like SharePoint in there if you really wanted to. Don't do that, really don't. You could do that, but they haven't actually released it yet. They said coming soon. And Windows containers require a little bit more CPUs and memory. It takes 2 CPUs and 3.5 gigs of memory. So I'm not sure when that's coming up. And there's also this cool thing called a Kubernetes connector, which they released. So Kubernetes is a container orchestration layer. I won't go into detail about that, but it really can allow you to basically get cloud scale infrastructure on demand, just saying I've got a Kubernetes host, I want 5 million containers, and it will just provision 5 million containers for you in
how
our
many
edge.
cores and how much memory for a Linux container?
1 or 1.5, and 1 gigabyte of RAM is the minimum. So you can get them real small. And I'm going to provision a one core 1.5 gigabyte one in a
Does that
second.
mean if you're running 2 containers, you'll need double that on the
Well,
server?
you'll need 2 cores and 1.5 gigs of
No,
RAM.
what I mean is if you're running 2 containers and each container requires that much, do you need double that much to be running the 2 containers on your server?
Well, you would, but of course we haven't. You won't ever see any visibility of that. So, if you needed 2 containers with 2 gigs or 1 gig of RAM each, underlying the VM, they will just give you 2 gigs of RAM, and give you the 2.
As long as your infrastructure has that much.
Well, as long as Microsoft has that much, and hopefully they have. So you never see the operating system, the underlying stuff. They just give you a container and say, we've given you a core, we've given you 1.5 gigs of RAM, your container is guaranteed to have that. There could be 50 other containers on that machine, all consuming the same thing. They could be other people's. You really have no idea, no
You're
visibility.
talking about container as a service rather than having Docker and generating the containers from your own infrastructure.
Exactly. It's container as a service. Maybe they should call that CAAS or something. So, yeah, we're going to soon run out of the AAS, ZA. So, okay, so basically, there's a little summary of when you might use the different container services. But I'm going to jump back to the demo now. I think it's time for a demo. Yeah, let's go to demo. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the image I deployed previously, and I'm actually going to run that in an ACI, and this is where things get tricky. What I can do is I can, of course, create an ACI straight in the Azure portal. So what I'll do is I'll do that. I might as well. So all I got to do is add a. Oh, and helpfully I've obviously been doing a lot of ACIs, so don't know why I'm looking up there. Okay, so all I need to do is name my container, and I'm going to call it demo. Don't know why it's an API, right? It's an ACI. And I can pick my container registry type. So I've got public and private. Of course, I want to do it private because I just created my ACR. So that means basically I'm going to use my private registry to get my images. If I use public, it would go to Docker Hub, or Hub, I think it's hub.docker.com. And I'm going to pick the name of my image. And that was the image I previously created. I'm actually going to go and get that from here. So Docker image names are quite specific. Basically, the bit at the front is it can be considered the URL of the registry, and then they've got their app name and the version number. I'm just going to say latest, so it's going to go grab the latest one. I'm going to use my login server as my ACR server, and I'm going to use this username and password that I'll be changing really soon to generate this. I would normally, if I wasn't, I would normally actually do this straight via the Azure Cloud Portal, because that's the only actual way you can do it. If you don't use this, if you want to automate it, you've got to use Cloud Shell at the moment. So I'll do that. I'll just create a new one. Now, one thing about this, if you can't create a ACI instance into a resource group that's already got something. So if it's got anything in there, it'll say no. So I'm going to create a new demo ACI RG, and there's only a few places you can create them. It won't tell you that you can't until you get to the end, of course, and it says no, sorry. So East US is one of those locations. I've listed
the preview, right?
It's still it's way previewed. Yeah. So as you can see, we've got number of cores and the amount of memory to assign to it, and whether I want a public or private IP address.
So what's the daily rate for a Windows container that's got 2 cores and 3.5K?
Well, handily enough, they do give you this handy little thing. I noted it down here somewhere. Cost. So, essentially, you're going to pay like this. Essentially, you're going to create. Now, the create request is basically the number of times you start that container. So you're paying about, I don't know, 0.0038 cents per request. But the memory and cores are really what you're paying for, so that's per second. So they've got down the bottom here in my presentation, they've actually got some average.
Is that per hour?
No,
Seconds.
Per second.
Otherwise, that would be, you could run your entire data center off it.
Just multiply by 3600.
Yeah.
I didn't see it costing enough. How much does that work out for a day?
We've got this so this is an example. We got 30 create requests for 300 seconds, so that's 5 minutes container with 1 core, and that's a total cost of 44 cents to run that 300 seconds times 30 times a day. So these things are generally, you're not going to run them 24/7, but if you want to, you're probably better off with an ACS or...
So that was 44 cents for 5 minutes, did you say?
5 minutes times 30. So 30 times a day times 5. And that was 1 core, and I think, how much memory? 1 gigabyte of RAM. But if you're, say, running it for longer or shorter, 1,500 requests, so that's running 1,500 containers for 150 seconds, you're going to pay $20. So if you really want to run your website, your web app 24/7, this isn't going to be the best budget. But if you need to run a container for just a short amount of time, lots of times, this will be a way better option money-wise. Plus, it's just so trivially easy. So, I can also expose a port. So, of course, websites typically going to run a port. In this case, mine's running on port 80, and it's going to validate my settings. Thankfully, it passes, and okay. So now this is going to start the creation process. It's actually pretty quick once it's to provision. But I've run it a couple of times when it just seems to sit there and do nothing for a while, and even though the container's there, it's not reporting anything. So if it does that, I'll destroy it and create a new one using the script. So it actually creates it. If you create it via the portal, it gives you this random name, and I don't like that. So if you create it via Cloud Shell up here, it will give you something that's a little bit, you can define that name.
Can you rename your random name?
Nope. Not yet, anyway. Not that I've come across. I haven't actually dug too much into that. So as you can see, it's actually provisioned. One thing to mention, it actually provisions a container group. And in that group, you can have a lot of containers. You don't have to have one. But if you want to put a lot of containers in a container group, you need to use ARM templates for that, Azure Resource Manager templates, or PowerShell when it arrives.
So you're talking different containers, not just instances.
Not just different containers. So you might have a SQL Server container, and you might have a front-end web app and some business logic apps, and you could have a number of different things.
They're all in the same container group.
All in the same container group.
Scale each one independently.
Yeah, exactly. So now let's see if this is going to start up. There's no refresh button on the screen, which would be really handy right now. So as you can see, my container's running, and it's given me an IP address. Notice it's Linux, but I've written using .NET. So this is sometimes bit here takes a while. It says it's running, but it's not. So there's my container running up there in Azure, and it didn't take very long. It would have actually probably took a lot less time to spin that up if I'd done it by code, because you can actually monitor it. It tells you when it's up, and it's a little bit more slick. You can also get log information through the Azure Cloud Shell. Everything's got to be done by Cloud Shell or this. The activity log in here isn't particularly useful yet, but it should be once they productionize it. But if I was wanting to get the actual detailed logs, so every time I hit my container, it will give me a log entry. I can actually just use the Cloud Shell and use AZ container show logs. I think it's logs, one of the commands anyway, and it just gives you all the logs, dumps them onto the screen. So that's pretty much it. I do have some other demos. I could go really hardcore nuts and show you deployment of like persistent containers with persistent storage. I was spinning up GoCD and Nexus containers, all these other various services which need persistent storage. But it's probably not that exciting. You just go, it's just another container, what's the big deal? But you know, there's a lot of stuff going on underneath it. So if you do want to have a look at that, the documentation's there. It's broken, so it's broken on the Microsoft site. It's very beta, you know, it's preview. If you do try and use it, I do suggest just use my script, because it makes things a lot easier. All you have to really do is this. I'll show you what the script looks like. Let's see if I can make that a bit bigger for you. So again, my password's on the screen. So this was me making a GoCD server, just specifying my username, my password, and tenant, you know, Active Directory account, and basically my subscription, and then the name of the app I want to deploy. And this is deploying from Docker Hub. So this is not a container created by me. This was actually created by someone else. And this is the volume name I'm mounting. So what actually that does is it creates an Azure file share, then it mounts that Azure file share in a path in that underlying infrastructure. So when I shut that when I delete that container, you never shut down containers, you just delete them. That storage is persistent. So when I start that new container up, say there's a new version of this app I want to deploy, start it up, and it's got all the data still persisting. So that's how you patch containers. You delete them, you start the new version up, and that's it. It's gone. So I think we've pretty much covered everything. I think I've got one more slide in here, which is really just around the limitations that there currently is. So you can't, you have to manage in Cloud Shell or portals, so there's no Azure PowerShell, Linux, CLI. Linux containers only right now, Windows containers coming soon. You can't restart containers, so you've got to redeploy. It's a bit of a pain, but they are going to have a restart feature where you can basically say, just redeploy the same container. So yeah, there we go. Summary, takeaway: Azure Container Registry, store your private company's containers up in the cloud, pretty cheap, and Azure Container Instances just run containers really easily and really quickly without the overhead. Cool. Cool. That's it. Any questions?
So what would be a use case to run up, the container 30 times a day?
It's a good question. For what our teams are here, what we're thinking or looking at using this for is we deploy a lot of apps. We have a lot of apps. We have a lot of websites, all sorts of stuff going up. We need to automatically test these. We need to run a whole lot of automation on them. So what we're thinking of using it for is basically we're going to run these things up and then use them as test clients to hammer these. We're also going to use them for things like SonarQube services, which do code analysis and static code analysis, all sorts of stuff. So if you have a particular service that what's some other use cases. Just if you want to demo something for someone, you can start these containers up, or if you're a developer and you need to do some testing, you might fire this stuff up in the cloud, run some tests on it, and then bring it back down, make sure everything's working.
So you could do like batch processing as well. You know,
Yeah.
So if you've got a queue of stuff building up, and then like 5 times a day you just want to clear the queue out, you could just spin up like 10, 20, 30 containers, clear the queue, and then delete them again, and wait for the queue to build.
Yeah, it's actually, that's one of the other use cases that Microsoft says, is that you're gonna, if you have, say, a Kubernetes container cluster, and this is a big heavyweight thing, suddenly you've done it's running your web app, you've done a marketing campaign, suddenly you've got 1 billion people hitting up your site. What you could use ACI for is just spin up all this extra compute, and then when you're done, it just deletes it all. And those can scale up because they deploy within a few seconds, as opposed to a VM. You can really run them quite quickly. And of course, because you can run Linux or Windows in them, and containerization is sort of the way of deployment these days, it's a pretty cool service. It's just so easy to get started.
With your website, you've demoed, checking up one very simple website, putting an IP address in front of it and browsing to it, and there it is. How much more work are you needing to do that load balancing to say get to that point? 1 billion customers can hit your website and have that distributed across your 10,000 container worker farm.
Good question. I mean, typically, if you're going to do that, what you'd do is you'd use the Kubernetes connector.
Yeah.
So the Kubernetes connector basically allows you to say, here's my Kubernetes cluster. I want to connect my Kubernetes cluster to ACI. And your Kubernetes cluster will manage the workload on there and say, I need some extra resource. We're running low. So what it will do is use that Kubernetes cluster to start spinning up ACI resources. And the Kubernetes cluster just sees these as other nodes in your pods in your cluster. So it can start scaling these things out. And when it's done with them, it scales them back, and your container's gone, and you're not paying anymore. So that's the use case. Yeah, that's the Elasticsearch, exactly. So if you wanted to load balance these, you put a load balancer in front of them. If you're thinking about load balancing, you're probably better off using an Azure Container Service instance. This is really for these short-lived, things where you really don't just want to run them for just a little bit of time and make it easy, simple. So testing, automation, batch processing, that sort of thing.
Because you need that orchestration service if you're getting to any sort of scale. So what Dan went through here is obviously running a container and running a container as an instance, and kind of maybe scaling out a couple of those instances. But once you start having like tens or hundreds of different types of containers spread across multiple machines, all fluctuating at different times, doing all of that manually is like impossible.
Yeah.
It'll be like a massive overhead.
It sounds like I need to go and hail the manual for Kubernetes.
Yeah, so Kubernetes is an example of one of these orchestrator bits of software which handles all that for you. So you can tell Kubernetes, I want to run this container across 100 machines or 100 instances of it, and then it spreads that load out for you. And if one of the containers fails, Kubernetes notices and can kill it and then build another one for you. So it does all that automatically. Yeah, and then there's like Docker Swarm and DCOS are the other two options.
Yeah.
I think in Azure, yeah.
And are all these identical containers? Is that what you're referring to?
Yep.
And
Well,
they're
yeah.
all sharing the same databases, etc.
Well, if I had a back-end database, say I had a website and I had a back-end database that had it contain all my stuff, I would have identical containers deployed, 100 identical containers, all sharing a single back-end database.
And so the advantages of having many containers that the performance is better when people are accessing. So you're accessing multiple different containers rather than all accessing the same instance.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately gives you that extra flexibility to just really start to scale in a more granular way. So you can, if your front end needs more extra performance, you can just start scaling these things up pretty easily. So, yeah, I mean, containers, yeah.
Forgive me, I've been late, I was at CR years ago. So does that mean then that what you were saying about how you got your failover for your containers, does that mean you no longer need to have affinity groups? Or does affinity groups only really work for Windows machines?
Well, affinity groups was really only, I think it's more of a Windows clustering concept, whereas containers, you could do that sort of thing if you had, say, a load balancer that could handle that in front of your containers, but you just don't care. Your container cluster or orchestrator like Kubernetes just says, I will feed traffic to whichever container's alive, and I won't worry about state. That's another important thing. Containers are generally stateless. However, there is an exception. That's service fabric. If you want to run stateful microservice container architecture, you go for service fabric. But then that's as I said, Xbox Live runs on that stuff, so it's got a lot of, it's heavyweight. It's not just a. Plus, that's globally distributed. So you could have an entire container cluster stretching across the world, and shared knowledge and state between nodes. Say your entire Australia data center goes offline. The idea is that your traffic would then suddenly start going to US, and your state is maintained.
Yeah, and another thing with regard to kind of containers versus virtual machines is that when you're thinking about application solutions hosted on VMs, it's kind of monolithic almost. So like the entire app sits on a VM, and then if you scale it out, you have like another whole version of that app going out. Whereas when you're constructing or architecting for containers, you kind of want to split that app into its different services, its different component pieces. So you'd have a bit that serves the front end, and a bit that accesses the databases, and a bit that does some processing work. So you split your app into a bunch of different services, and then you run each of those services within a container. So that if sometime during the day you have a lot of load on your front end, only the front end containers scale out. If you have a lot of processing at certain times of the day, the front end containers scale back, and the processing containers scale out. So it's not that you're scaling out the entire application each time.
Yeah, it's awesome technology.
Yeah.
I was going to say way of the future, but it's one of those things
It's the way of the past 10 years, isn't it?
Yeah, and when you look at Docker Hub and you look at the containers available from these people, you find most products are available in a container. Even all the Azure tools. So if you want to run the Azure client CLI, you don't have to put it on your machine. Why? That's so last century. Why don't we just run a container up in the cloud and remote into the container and just use the tools in there. That way you've always got the latest version of the tools. You don't really worry about updating. It's pretty cool. So there's a lot of stuff to be done there. I'm just changing my key for my.
Don't do it there. Still streaming.
Yeah. So any other questions? Any other thoughts?
Yeah. Then can you run TMG, SharePoint, Exchange, etc., etc.?
You could. Well, Exchange I think would be a stateful app, and I think you could run a stateful. You could run Exchange and Service Fabric.
You can pretty much run what you want, right? But it's not the right use case for it.
Yeah.
If you think about that monolithic idea, so if it's this one big thing, you don't want to put it inside a container. There'll be a better way to do it. Or if it's a group of small services that all kind of work together, that's perfect for containerization.
Is that the same case like, again, I should have been here earlier, so if you've got like say 20 little services all talking to each other, and you want to update that one because somebody came up with some idea, so you just replace that?
Yeah,
one?
absolutely. That's it. Yeah.
Gotcha.
So each little service within your app can be upgraded independently of each other. So like if one team is working on one aspect of the app, they can update it as often as they want without impacting another team. Yeah, you don't need to like roll the whole thing out together.
I'm moving to get my next certifications.
No, cool.
Cool. Anything else?
Well done. Thanks, Dan. That was awesome.
Cheers, guys. I have to change all my passwords.
All right, thanks everyone for coming along. How many people do we have streaming?
We did have three that sort of pitched in.
Yeah, cool.
Sort of stuck around for about 30 or 40 minutes on average.
Sweet.
Yeah.
Good. Nice. Yeah, second Wednesday of every month. We've got 3 more left this year, I think. So come along. See you next time. Yeah, mate.
What's the storage rate, Nigel?
You want to jump up, Fred? From the horse's mouth.
Yeah. So guys, so we're not going to be running Ignite this year.
Ooh, yes.
Yeah. We so we're just in talks. Though we're not actually going to be running it this year, we are looking at running it next year, right? And maybe looking at a different cadence of running it as well. So currently, there's not going to be no Ignite this year. Just so you know.
No bags, no t-shirts.
Partners countrywide tour?
Sorry? Yes, there is comms going on. Yeah, there's comms going now. Oh, have gone out. But I'll double check with our LPR guy. But yeah,
So like a partner connect event that you normally do just at the front end of Ignite, you're still going to run a partner connect?
there'll be still partner focused events.
Yeah.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
In saying that, there probably would be something.
Oh, no, we're still
like
eating
that,
something
something
from books and stuff.
smaller.
I think it's
Maybe something a little bit more community based as well.
So,
Just wait and see.
Did you use the deposit back
they sleep in a cage.
That's good.
Can the webcast be, is the webcast published?
Yeah, it's on YouTube, so you can go back and watch it later.
There's a link in the meetup directly to the video, so feel free to.
The other one.
Yeah. Yeah, I've seen it. It happens very much.